David J. Dallin was a one-time Menshevik leader and later a writer and lecturer on Soviet affairs, who helped Victor Kravchenko defect in the 1940s. Youth. Dallin was born in Rogachow of White Russia in 1889. He studied at the University of St. Petersburg from 1907 to 1909, when he faced arrest and imprisonment for anti-Tsarist political activity. After 2 years of imprisonment, he fled Russia to Germany. He studied at the University of Berlin and obtained his doctorate in economics from the University of Heidelberg in 1913. Career. Menshevik politician. Following the February Revolution of 1917, Dallin returned to Russia. He won election to the Central Committee of the Menshevik group of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party and represented the group on the Moscow City Soviet from 1918 to 1921. The Bolsheviks arrested him a first time in 1920, and he avoided a second arrest in 1922 by fleeing back to Germany. He stayed in Germany until the Nazis forced him to leave in 1935, when he settled in Poland. He stayed in Poland until the outbreak of World War II in 1939, when he moved to the United States. Kravchenko Affair. Through a friend of his wife Lilia, Dallin came to welcome Victor Kravchenko in the home in New York in January 1944. The next day, Kravchenko revealed his wish to defect from the Soviet embassy. Dallin encouraged Kravchenko to defect. He approached the former U.S. ambassador to Russia, William C. Bullitt, whom he had known in Moscow, for advice. Bullitt called Attorney General Francis Biddle and then extricated himself from the matter. Biddle brought in the FBI. In March, Dallin met Kravchenko in Pennsylvania, where the latter had an official trip. Dallin advised Kravchenko about his contact with the FBI. Kravchenko followed his advice and contacted the FBI, who interviewed him 3 times in Washington before the end of the month. Dallin and his wife then met Kravchenko when he arrived in New York again in April as a defector. Dallin advised Kravchenko to tell his story to the New York Times as soon as possible. Kravchenko began drafting his story that first night. The next day, Dallin brought New York Times labor journalist Joseph Chaplin to meet Kravchenko. When Chaplin and Kravchenko did not get along, Dallin turned to a former United Press correspondent to Moscow, Eugene Lyons, by then editor of the American Mercury. He also introduced him to Isaac Don Levine and Max Eastman. Lyons, Levine, and Eastman would form the core group of co-writers and co-editors of Kravchenko's best-selling memoir, I Chose Freedom. Dallin would form part of a second tier of supporters. New leader. Dallin joined the staff of the left-wing anti-communist magazine, The New Leader in New York, where he worked for nearly 20 years. He wrote numerous books and newspaper and magazine articles on economic and political subjects, particularly Soviet affairs. Dallin also was a visiting professor of political science at the University of Pennsylvania. Personal life. Family. Earlier in life, Dallin married a woman named Eugenia. In New York, he left Eugenia and lived with Lilia Ginsburg Ostrin before marrying her by 1944. When the Dallins became involved in Kravchenko's defection, Dallin and Eugenia had a son, Alexander Dallin, born overseas, who later became a prominent academic expert in Soviet studies. Death. Dallin died in New York in 1962. He was survived by his second wife and son. Impact. As American historian John L. Haynes, Jr. has written, Dallin and Boris Nikolevsky's 1947 forced labor in Soviet Russia had been a pioneering study of the Soviet labor camp system, well received in the academic world at the time, but again in 1960s it was retroactively discredited among most American scholars due to its use of defector testimony and J.Dallin's Menshevik Origins. Indeed, Dallin and Nikolevsky's 1947 book was so thorough erased from American academic memory that the appearance of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago in the mid-1970s came as an unexpected shock. However, New Left academics had come to dismiss Dallin's works by the mid-1960s due to his citations of testimony from defectors and exiles plus congressional and FBI investigations, all seen as anti-communist. Such evidence was increasingly distrusted, and Dallin's Menshevik past was taken as reason for skepticism as well. Haynes has noted, works translations of other books are by Sloan und die Sozialentwicklung von Dr. David Lewin. Books in English Big Three: The United States, Britain, Russia. Forced Labor in Soviet Russia, with Boris I. Nikolevsky, Soviet Russia and the Far East. Economics of Slave Labor, Rise of Russia in Asia, New Soviet Empire, Soviet Espionage, Changing World of Soviet Russia, Soviet Foreign Policy After Stalin, From Purge to Coexistence, Essays on Stalin's and Khrushchev's Russia, books translated into English. Soviet Russia's Foreign Policy, 1939–1942, translated by Leon Denon. Russia and Post-War Europe, translated by F. K. Lawrence. Real Soviet Russia, translated by Joseph Chaplin. Books translated into German. Zwangsarbeit in Sowjetrussland, with Boris I. Nikolevsky, translated by Victor Brofman. Essays, Reports, What is Behind the Soviet Proposal for a Summit Conference. Conference with Dr. David J.Dallin, United States Congress, House Committee on Un-American Activities, Mensheviks, From the Revolution of 1917 to the Second World War, edited by Leopold H. Heimson, with contributions by David Dallin al., translated by Gertrude Wacker.